I'm Russ Briot with the Shroud of Turin Education Project. Welcome to the Shroud Report. My guest today is Mark Guscin from Spain. And now, whereabouts in Spain?
La Coruña is a city right up in the northwest corner, right on the coast, and it's a very nice place to live.
Now, the fame of this place is that it's near a town called Oviedo.
That's right. And Oviedo is a place where, for a long time now, there's been a cloth there known as the Sudarium of the Lord, okay, which has never really been taken into account up till 10 years ago. It's always been there. Nobody's ever denied that it's been there, and it's always been called the Sudarium of the Lord. I say Sudarium because I don't think, I'd like to use that word in English, because I don't think there's a really appropriate translation for it in the English language.
Now, the Sudarium, if we go to the Gospel account of what was left in the tomb after the resurrection, there's this thing called the Sindon, which is the long linen shroud.
That's right.
And the Sudarium, which is what
right.
you're talking about.
This is actually mentioned in John's Gospel, chapter 20. The situation is where Peter and John are running to the tomb. They've heard that the body's gone, so they run to the tomb. And you know the story. John stays outside, stoops down to look in. Peter runs in. And what do they see? They see the shroud lying as it was before, and left to one side, what they see is what they call the Sudarium. And John mentions in his Gospel 3 times in the same sentence that it was separate. It wasn't with the shroud. It was lying apart, and it was lying to one side. Now, this is the cloth that we think is the Oviedo cloth.
Now, I've heard this described, at least here in the States, as the face cloth of Oviedo.
Well, yeah, that's what it has been called. It has received various names over the centuries, but, well, in Latin at least, it's always been called Sudarium Domini, the Sudarium of the Lord. Why not face cloth? Because there's no one word in English that will express to us everything that the word Sudarium meant to a first century person living in the Roman Empire. A face cloth, we would associate that with washing.
Right.
Some translations it's called a napkin. Now, a napkin for me is something that we use when we're having lunch or dinner. It's also been called a funeral cloth. That's not accurate either.
So there's really nothing that accurately describes this thing. And
no, and that's funny, because that exactly the same thing happened with other ancient languages. This is a pure Latin word. Now, Greek had no equivalent, so it just adopted the Latin word. Hebrew had no equivalent, so it adopted the Latin word. Syriac had no equivalent. It did exactly the same thing, adopted the Latin word, because that's just the easiest thing to do, which is why in the English language I like to keep calling it Sudarium.
Okay. Now, why were there 2 cloths? What is the Sudarium?
Well, let's say it's, first of all, a lot of people sometimes think we're talking here about a competitor. I've heard this before. Some people have said, you're saying you've got the real shroud, and these guys in Turin have got a false one. And I said, no, exactly the opposite. This is a complementary cloth.
Okay.
Now, if you read those verses in John's Gospel, that actually confirms that. What it says is, the Sudarium that had been, past perfect tense, had been over Jesus' head. We're talking about before the shroud. And as we'll see a bit later on, well, all the forensic studies and everything done on the cloth point to its having been used from the moment of death up till when the body was taken to the tomb and laid out in the larger shroud. We're talking about a use this immediately before the big shroud, the Turin shroud.
So, okay, so it was used around the face, around the head.
Only around the head, yeah.
Okay.
It's a small cloth that measures, it measures approximately 83 by 52 centimeters.
Okay.
Don't ask me that in inches, because I'm not too sure of the measurement
Probably
in
by
inches.
3 feet by 2 feet, somewhere in that range.
Well, yeah, we'll see the cloth later on.
Okay, you have
I've got a model of it
brought
here.
a replica of it, and later on we're going to actually show how that was wrapped around a real human head.
Yeah, exactly the same way as, by reproducing the stains on the cloth that have been reproduced in a laboratory and can be reproduced any number of times. It's a scientific thing.
And that's the key, that it is this cloth, and it is covered with stains.
Yeah, it's covered with stains that look like blood, but when you actually analyze them, the main stains is 1 part blood and 6 parts what we call is liquid from a pulmonary edema, which all sounds very nice. What it is when you die asphyxiated, which is the most probable cause of death when you're crucified, all of this liquid, the edema liquid, collects in your lungs. And quite logically, whenever it can, it's going to come out through the nose and the mouth, especially through the nose. They're the main central stains that are on this cloth.
Well, I tell you, it sounds fascinating and gruesome at the same time.
It is. It is quite gruesome.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but it's something that to get to the bottom of the mystery of the shroud, this cloth may hold some clues for us. And well, we're going to be right back in just a minute with the Shroud Report and find out a little bit more about this Oviedo cloth. Hi, I'm Russ Brialt, and welcome back to the Shroud Report. My guest is Mark Guscin from Spain. Now, wait a minute. You live in Spain, but you speak with an English accent.
That's right. That's because I'm English.
Oh, you're English.
Yeah.
But you live in Spain.
Born in England, but I've lived in Spain for the last 14 years.
Okay. Okay. Now, this is fascinating. The Sudarium of Oviedo. Now, you've brought with us some slides, and
right,
so why don't we take a look at what we have here?
Okay. Well, first slide. Let's say this is just to get situated. You know, there's a map of Europe. You can see Spain down in the bottom left-hand corner, and the part that's marked in red up there is Asturias, which is the area. Within that little red area, that's where we have the city of Oviedo. Now, without going into too much detail about Spanish history, Spain was conquered by the Arabs at the beginning of the 8th century, and that's where the reconquest started. You know, that little red area is the first Christian kingdom in post-Arab Spain, let's say. Okay, so now we know where we're talking about.
Next slide.
The next slide just shows us the cathedral in Oviedo, okay? This is where, within that building, is where the Sudarium is kept.
It's beautiful.
It is. It's a really, really nice town and cathedral. So, let's get into some history. This is one of the many documents from various countries, okay, that tell us the history of the Sudarium. This is probably the earliest document. This is a 10th or 11th century document from a small town called Valenciennes in the northeast of France, okay? Now this gives us all the cities where the Sudarium had been, starting from Jerusalem, then going across the north of Africa, fleeing from the Persian invasion at the beginning of the 7th century, enters into the Spanish peninsula and goes through Cartagena is the port of entry, and it goes up to Seville, although that's not mentioned in this particular manuscript, Toledo, and then when the Arabs invaded Spain, right up to the north of the country that we saw on the first one. And the Sudarium's in there. It's mentioned in that document. One of many. It's a very well-established history.
So it has an established historical trail.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's no doubts about it. We don't have to be identifying the cloth with anything else.
So how far back does the historical trail go?
Well, it has been documented all the way back to the year, definitely without any doubt at all, to the year 570 when it was still in Jerusalem.
Wow.
Some Italian pilgrims saw it. Well, they didn't actually see it. They went to a cave where it was kept, but they couldn't actually get to see it. But we're talking about this cloth. There's a document that's a very obscure document written by Nonos of Panopolis. The problem with this is that nobody even knows who he was or when he lived. Sometime between the 3rd and the 5th century. He speaks about it as though he's seen it as well in Jerusalem.
Well, so possibly even back to the 3rd century then. Wow, that's phenomenal.
Okay, let's go on to the next slide.
Okay.
Here we can actually see, on the top here, that's the Sudarium. You can see that it's in a frame. That's how it's normally kept, okay? You can see that it's symmetrical. If you look at number 2 and number 3, you've got two groups there of symmetrical stains. The stains that are labelled B, we're going to come back to those because they're very interesting in their own right. Now that's the fluid that we were talking about before. There's 1 part blood, 6 parts, all of this fluid that came out of the lungs. Okay?
Because I see some dark areas and lighter areas, and you're saying the darker areas would be blood, and the lighter areas would be this fluid?
It's all a mixture. What happened there is that there's various stains, what we call superimposed on each other. You can see that they've got their own outlines. In other words, one stain was made, it dried. Another stain was made on top of that, from the same source, and on the same cloth, and that then later dried. That's why you see it darker in the middle.
I see. Okay.
Okay? Now, underneath that, you can see that the cloth has been taken out of its frame. The part that's labelled 1 was actually the part that was in direct contact with the dead body. How do we know that? Because there are actually small scabs of real blood on there. That's how we know that, okay? You can see again that the cloth had been folded over on itself.
And the blood has been tested?
Yeah, the blood group is AB.
AB.
Exactly the same blood group as on the shroud.
Same as the shroud.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, we're going to the next slide. Now, all of these stains have been scientifically reproduced in a laboratory, and it can be done again and has been done again any number of times. In other words, we are talking about scientific experiment that can be repeated. You know, that's scientific proof.
Right.
That shows us how the stains were made, how long it took to make them, and how long elapsed between the formation of each group of stains. How was that done? With this model head that we can see here under laboratory conditions. In the bottle at the front, that's actually the real stuff. You know, we're talking about the real thing there. That is 1 part blood, 6 parts pulmonary edema fluid.
And this fluid that you're talking about is because the person who was crucified would die from asphyxia.
That's right.
The inability to breathe.
Yeah.
And that would cause this collection of fluid into the lungs.
Yeah.
And then when one finally expires, especially when they're laid on the ground flat, this stuff would just kind of come out.
Once the pressure is released from the chest muscles and from the lungs, then it just sort of spurts out through the nose, which was why this cloth was used. You know, you can see from some of the stains, if you look at them under a microscope,
and
there was somebody holding the cloth to the nose. You know, it was a left hand, and you can see the actual outlines within the stains of the fingers. You know, someone was holding the cloth to the dead body's nose.
And of course, the Romans who did crucifixions all the time knew this, and this was just kind of probably a standard procedure of when someone is removed from the cross.
Or when they're still on the cross.
Or when they're
We're
still
going to
on.
see in a minute that, you know, it was first applied while the body was still on the cross.
Okay. And
you know, but we're talking here, maybe not like we sometimes see in traditional art, of a very, very elevated, high-up cross, in which case someone would have needed some kind of ladder to get up to put this on. But you think just to be crucified, you really only need, you can be any distance off the ground.
You could be
as long as you're off the ground,
you
could be 6
inches off the ground.
In which case, this cloth, you know, it could have been put round the head while the body was still on the cross by somebody just standing on the ground.
Right.
On tiptoe, okay?
Okay.
Now, what all these experiments have shown us, let's begin here.
Okay.
You can see there the stains. If we look at the left part of that slide, you see the stains highlighted on that. Now, those correspond to the nose, the mouth, and the beard, okay, down at the bottom.
Okay.
Now, the only way that it was possible to reproduce those stains was with the head, well, let's say with the head, but this means the whole body, in a vertical position. The head was tilted 70 degrees forward, 20 degrees to the right, perfectly compatible with the crucifixion position.
Right.
We should also say that it's definitely, without any doubt, a dead body. You know, if there was any breathing movement, it was impossible to actually form these stains. We are talking about a corpse here.
A corpse.
Okay? Now, this means that the Oviedo cloth was first wrapped around the head while the body was still on the cross. And it was left in that position to form those stains for some time between 45 minutes and an hour.
Okay. Now, why?
That's how long it took, because at this moment...
Using the experiment.
Using the experiment, there's still all the pressure on the lungs, so the liquid is not coming out very quickly at the moment. It's just dribbling out through the nose and through the mouth. Now, in order to reproduce that exactly as it is on the cloth, that's the time that's needed.
Now, that corresponds with the biblical account, because we know that at some point Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pontius Pilate and asks to be able to bury Christ, and Pontius Pilate expresses amazement that Jesus was already dead. So there's a period of time that Joseph had to go find Pilate and then come back with maybe a band of Roman soldiers, and then that's when they stabbed him in the side to make sure that he was dead before they would release him to be buried, and that would have easily taken 45 minutes.
Easily, 45 minutes to an hour.
To an hour, okay. And then
you've got to think, yeah, he was still on the cross. You know, they had to make sure.
Okay.
You know, because the normal procedure would have been get the body down, just throw it into a common grave with other criminals.
Right.
But here we've got this influential figure, Joseph of Arimathea, saying, just a minute, you know, I'm going to ask Pontius Pilate, the boss, you know, for permission. So they waited.
Okay.
But meanwhile, the face was covered.
Okay.
Why? Because it was covered in blood. That's standard Jewish procedure. You know, it's a very unpleasant sight. It's a violently deformed face covered in blood. Cover it.
and we've talked with another researcher who said that that's called lifeblood, the blood that flowed after death, and so
this is post-mortem blood. This is this is scientifically all of the stains that we can see at the moment is post-mortem blood.
But according to the Jewish tradition, that would all have to be buried with the body.
I understand.
Right?
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They are actually keeping the blood.
Right.
So that it's not just lost on the floor.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So we look at the next slide, and we can see here again on the left, the highlighted stains here are up at the top. Now these would correspond on a 3D model or head to stains on the forehead.
Mm-hmm.
These caused some problems to reproduce. It took a while to work out how to do them. And in the end, the only way that they could be done was with the arms still outstretched. Now whether that means they were still nailed to the crossbar or not, we don't know, but they were still in that position. The liquid was then dribbling out through the nose, the body's horizontal on the floor, face down,
okay,
and the liquid was coming out through the nose, dribbling up, was gathering in the eyebrow, on this side,
mm-hmm.
and on the forehead. They're the stains that we can see there.
So that stain would have occurred when the body had been taken down from the cross and perhaps laid on the ground.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
And
same time, another between 45 minutes and 1 hour in that position. Okay?
Okay.
Now, after that, the arm, let's say, was moved down. The cloth was wrapped all the way around the head, and then the body was moved, which is when the liquid really started spurting out through the nose.
Okay.
The body was moved, it was being moved, you can tell that from the stains. There has to be some movement involved for between 5 and 10 minutes, which again corresponds perfectly with moving the body from Golgotha to the tomb, which, as all the Gospels say, was nearby. We're talking about 5 or 10 minutes walking, carrying a dead body. Okay? So if we go on to the next slide, we see here on the right, well, you see the Sudarium has been wrapped around somebody's head.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are some stains on the back of the head highlighted there. If we look at the top left, we can see where they are on the Oviedo cloth. And just under that, well, is a magnified version. Now, these are wounds that are not post-mortem blood. This was blood shed while the man was still alive. We know it's a man because he had a beard.
Mm-hmm.
All this liquid was gathered in the beard. Now, these wounds were caused by short, sharp objects that could very well, correspond to a crown of thorns. But the really good thing about this, the fascinating thing about this, is that those stains, you can find them on the shroud as well, in exactly the same area on the back of the head.
Okay. So there's a correspondence there between these stains and the crown of thorn stains, or the apparent crown of thorn stains on the shroud.
And as I say, this blood was shed in life. Those wounds bled. To form those stains, those wounds must have bled about an hour before death, at least. Okay? All of this has come out, these are laboratory experiments. So here, what we can do is an overlay between those stains on the shroud, which we got on the left. They're coloured green here, just for the sake of the overlay, so it shows up better.
Okay.
Obviously, they're not green on the original, okay? And on the right-hand side, we've got the same stains on the Sudarium of Oviedo. So when we do an overlay, just turning the Sudarium round a bit because of the way it was applied, what we have in black is an absolutely perfect coincidence with that blood stain. We're also talking, as we've already said, it's the same blood group and the same blood type.
Now,
shed in life.
Now, it is similar to the way that they have been able to corroborate the historical trail of the shroud using pollen. There's been some pollen studies done on the Sudarium as well.
That's right. They were done initially by Max Fry as well, the same guy who did them on the shroud. Now, what those findings confirmed was that they just fitted in exactly, it was almost like it was a jigsaw puzzle that just went together with the same route that we saw before on that manuscript and all the other manuscripts. We've got pollen from Jerusalem, pollen from the north of Africa, and pollen from Spain. And there's no pollen from Constantinople or any other areas in Europe that can be limited to those places.
So and it kind of verifies that it may have started out at the same place, but historically, through time, they did not take the same route.
That's right. They followed a very different route. This one ended up in Spain, and it's got a much simpler history than the Shroud of Turin. And for that reason, it's much easier to verify that history.
Oh, this has been wonderfully fascinating. And we're going to come back in just a minute and actually show how this cloth may have been wrapped around a human head. So stay tuned to the Shroud Report. I'm Russ Brialt, and welcome back to the Shroud Report. We're having a fascinating show on the Sudarium of Oviedo. Now, David Alexander has agreed to be our victim today, and Mark, you're going to show how this cloth may have been wrapped around Christ when he was actually on the cross. So I'm going to step out and let you show us how that may have been done.
Okay. So we've got to remember while we're doing this, I'm just positioning David here. You could just put your head like that, resting on the arm, and a bit further forward. Okay, thanks. That all of this information has come out of the cloth itself. It's the cloth itself that showed us this. So what we know is that it was pinned to the back of the head. It was pinned into the hair with some kind of pins, probably made of bone. Okay, then it was taken round the front like this to cover the face. This is the obstacle that the person wrapping the cloth found. Okay, so instead of being able to wrap it all the way around the head, what was done was the cloth was simply doubled back on itself like this. That's exactly why we have the sets of symmetrical stains on the cloth. Okay, now this is the position that the cloth would have been left in for those 45 minutes to 1 hour while the body was on the cross, and exactly the same while it was on the ground. Now, when I spoke about the 5 to 10 minutes of the body being moved towards the tomb, at that moment, well, the arms were obviously moved down. The body was then carried. We're talking here about the body in a horizontal position. That released all the pressure on the lungs, on the chest muscles, which is when all the liquid really started pouring out of the nose. Now somebody's left hand, because you can see the outlines in the stains, was holding this cloth to the nose like that to absorb all of this liquid. Okay? Now, that's when the cloth was then wrapped all the way around the head like that. Okay? It was then, most probably, we've seen this from the crease marks up here, it would have been tied in a knot here. Okay? Now, when the body reached the tomb, it was very easy like that. You get hold of the knot, you lift it off the head, somebody just put it on the floor, or literally threw it on the floor, on one side, which is exactly how John describes the cloth. As being, you know, it's folded over, it's wrapped up, anything like that, and it was probably just left like that so that the body could be placed in the larger shroud.
That is absolutely fascinating. You know, David, thank you very much for being our volunteer. I think you being able to show it, it just adds so much to it.
And I think it's a lot easier to actually show it. You know, I could be talking about it for half an hour trying to explain it, but to actually see it like that really brings home, you know, how it was used. You see the position and everything.
This has been fascinating. Thank you for joining us on the Shroud Report. And Mark, thank you very much for coming all the way from Spain to do this with us.
Thank you very much, Russ.
Thank you. And stay tuned for the next Shroud Report.